It is said that in the early hours before the sun fully rises over Mashhad, when the last stars still cling to the sky like fading memories, and the streets are washed in a pale, trembling silence, there are moments when even time seems to lower its head in reverence. The old men of distant caravanserais still speak of those mornings as if they were not days but moods of the world itself, when the earth breathes softly, and the footsteps of wanderers echo more in the heart than in the streets. It was in such an hour that Dervish Yunis entered Mashhad. Though no trumpet announced his arrival and no gatekeeper remembered the exact moment, he passed through the city's sleeping thresholds. He came as he always did, quietly, as though he were only another thought passing through the mind of God, wrapped in a worn cloak that had known many winds, carrying nothing but a wooden staff, and the unseen weight of years spent listening to the world. The narrator of this tale once heard an old traveler say that Yunis did not walk upon cities, but upon their memories, and that he never disturbed what was already breaking in silence. In Mashhad at dawn the streets were not yet streets but long breaths of stone and dusted, and it was in these breaths that Yunis walked slowly, observing how the city dreams before waking. The lanterns outside closed shops flickered faintly, as if reluctant to surrender their light, and the scent of damp earth mixed with distant traces of rose water from yesterday's visitors. Somewhere far away, a muezzin's voice began to rise, not loudly at first, but as if testing the air, and even that sound seemed to hesitate before becoming fully present. Yunis stopped near an old wall where the plaster had cracked like the lines on an aged palm, and he placed his hand upon it as though reading something no book had ever contained. It is said that in such moments he would sometimes close his eyes, not in prayer alone, but in remembrance of every place that had ever felt like departure. The silent streets of Mashhad, still empty of hurried feet, carried the faint echo of pilgrims who would soon arrive, their footsteps bringing life, sorrow, hope, and exhaustion all at once, as they always do in sacred cities. But for now, there was only stillness, and in that stillness Yunis listened. The wind moved gently through narrow alleys, brushing against doors that had not yet opened, and it sounded like a distant conversation between time and longing. He walked past a tea-house where smoke from last night's fire still clung to the wooden beams, and inside overturned cups waited like forgotten questions. The narrator once heard that Yunis believed every empty cup holds the memory of the last person who drank from it, and so he never passed such places without pausing for a breath longer than necessary. As the sky slowly turned from ash to faint gold, he reached a small courtyard near an old shrine where water trickled softly from a stone basin, its rhythm steady as a tired heart. There he sat for a moment, not as a man seeking rest, but as one who understands that sitting is also a form of listening. The city around him remained half asleep, yet not entirely silent, for even silence in Mashhad seems to carry the weight of countless prayers spoken over centuries. Yunis lowered his gaze toward the ground where tiny cracks in the stone held small shadows, and in those shadows he seemed to see not visions, but reflections of ordinary lives. A baker waking before dawn, a mother warming bread, a traveler tying his worn sandals before continuing a journey he no longer remembers beginning. The narrator of this story must confess that such details were never spoken by Yunis himself, for he was a man of few words. But those who observed him believed that he did not need speech to understand the language of passing things. As the first true light of dawn touched the rooftops of Mashhad, painting them in a soft, uncertain gold, Yunis rose again and continued walking, blending once more into the city's awakening breath, while behind him the silent streets slowly began to remember themselves. And it was in this fragile boundary between night and morning that something unseen seemed to follow him, not a presence, not a spirit, but perhaps only the echo of all the moments he had ever witnessed without ever claiming them. And so Dervish Yunis continued through the awakening veins of Mashhad, where the first true signs of life began to rise like breath returning to a sleeping body, and the streets that had moments ago been only silence now carried the faint, hesitant rhythm of human presence. It is said that at dawn in sacred cities, even the stones seem to remember the footsteps of those who once prayed upon them, and in Mashhad this memory felt especially heavy, as if every corner held an invisible archive of longing. Yunis walked without haste, as though he had nowhere to arrive and nothing to escape, passing beneath archways where merchants would soon open their shutters and call out softly to the day, their voices still absent but already imagined in the wooden frames of their shops. The narrator once heard an old carpet seller from Nishapur say that Yunis never looked at objects as others do, but rather at the silence between them, and perhaps this is why even in the busiest streets he appeared untouched by hurry. Near the entrance of a slowly opening bazaar, he paused as a young man swept dust from the stone ground, each movement of the broom creating small clouds that dissolved instantly into the morning air. The young man did not recognize the dervish, for Yunis carried no sign of importance, no ornament of authority, only the quiet dignity of someone who has learned to listen more than he speaks. For a brief moment their eyes met, and nothing was exchanged except the kind of understanding that requires no language, as if both were aware that life is made of repeated beginnings that rarely announce themselves. The smell of freshly baked bread began to spread through nearby alleys, warm and grounding, and it mingled with the faint bitterness of tea being prepared in copper kettles inside half-open tea-houses. Yunis moved toward that scent, not in hunger alone, but as though following a thread of memory that belonged not entirely to him, but to everyone who had ever woken before sunrise. Inside one small tea-house, a few men sat quietly, their faces marked by the softness of sleepless nights and early labor, speaking in low tones about matters that seemed both important and forgettable at the same time. The narrator must note that Yunis did not intrude upon their gathering, but stood near the entrance where light and shadow met, observing how steam rose from cups like brief prayers that vanish before they can be held. One of the men, an older traveler with hands roughened by years of distance, noticed him and nodded slightly as if recognizing a fellow passenger of time, though no names were exchanged. It is said that Yunis believed every city reveals itself not in its monuments, but in such small gestures between strangers who may never meet again. Outside, the city continued to awaken more fully, and the sound of hooves on distant stone suggested that caravans or pilgrims were arriving, bringing with them stories from roads that stretched beyond memory. Yunis stepped back into the street, where the light had now grown stronger, but still carried a softness, like gold diluted with morning mist. He passed by a woman standing near a water jar, filling it slowly, her hands steady despite the early hour, and in her silence there was a kind of patience that only repetition teaches. She did not look at him directly, but the narrator believes she sensed his presence, for her movements slowed for a heartbeat before returning to their rhythm. The streets of Mashhad, though growing busier, still held pockets of quiet where time seemed reluctant to fully enter. And Yunis moved through these spaces, as one moves through remembered dreams that refuse to dissolve. At one point he stopped near a narrow lane, where old walls leaned toward each other, as if sharing secrets, and there he listened to a distant recitation from within a small courtyard, a voice reading verses that spoke of patience, loss, and return. The words were not clear enough to be repeated, yet their tone carried a weight that lingered in the air even after the voice ceased. The narrator once heard a pilgrim from Herat say that such moments in Mashhad are not meant to be understood, only carried. Yunis remained still until the recitation ended, then continued walking as if acknowledging that every sound has its rightful departure. As the sun rose further, casting longer shadows that stretched across the stones like slow-moving thoughts, the city became more defined, more certain of itself. Yet Yunis seemed to belong more to the uncertain edges where things are still becoming. And it was there, between the half-open doors and the unfinished sounds of morning, that he carried with him the quiet weight of everything he had seen without ever keeping. By the time the sun had fully risen above Mashhad, its light no longer hesitant but steady and revealing, the city had already begun to wear the mask of its daily life. And what had once been silence now turned into the layered sound of commerce, prayer, footsteps, and distant calling voices. Yet even in this fuller awakening, something of the early stillness remained beneath everything, like ink that has soaked into cloth and cannot be washed away. Dervish Yunis moved through this transformation as though it were not a change in the city but a passing mood within himself. For those who knew of him only in passing often said he never walked through time but alongside it. It is said that near the outer edge of the old quarters, where the streets begin to widen and the buildings lose their ancient intimacy, Yunis paused once more, not because he was lost, but because something in the air had grown heavy with memory. There he stood near a stone fountain, where water fell in a rhythm unchanged by centuries, and he watched how people now gathered around it with the simple urgency of daily life, filling containers, adjusting garments, exchanging brief words that would soon be forgotten. The narrator once heard an old pilgrim claim that Yunis never judged the world, but only observed how gently it continued to endure itself. A group of travelers passed nearby, their clothes carrying the dust of distant roads, and among them was a man who limped slightly, leaning on a stick, carved with unremarkable patterns. This man glanced at Yunis for a moment longer than the others did, as if trying to remember whether he had seen him in another city or another year. But memory is unreliable when it touches the unknown, and so he moved on without certainty. Yunis did not follow them with his eyes. Instead, he turned his gaze toward a narrow passage between two old walls where sunlight barely entered, and in that dim corridor he seemed to see not visions but absences, the kind left behind by lives that have already passed through. The narrator must say that, in such moments, those who observed him often felt a quiet sadness, though no sorrow was visible on his face, only a deep acceptance, like soil receiving rain without question. As the city's rhythm grew stronger, merchants now fully opening their shops, voices rising to announce goods and greetings, Yunis continued walking, passing a row of small stalls where spices were arranged in carefully measured piles of color and scent. The air there was thick with cinnamon, dried rose petals, and cardamom, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the entire history of distant caravans had gathered in that single street. A young vendor called out to him gently, offering dried fruit, but Yunis only nodded, not out of refusal but as if acknowledging the kindness of being seen. It is said that he rarely accepted anything that tied him to a place, not because he rejected the world, but because he carried it already within his awareness too fully to hold more. Further along, near a quiet corner where the noise of the bazaar softened, he encountered a small group of children sitting on the ground, drawing lines in dust with broken sticks, their laughter appearing and disappearing like birds crossing a sky that cannot be held. One child looked up at him with curiosity, and for a moment the child's expression shifted into something older than his years, as if recognizing in Yunis a reflection of journeys not yet understood. The dervish smiled faintly, not with joy or sorrow alone, but with the expression of someone who has seen how quickly all beginnings become distance. The narrator once heard an elder in Mashhad say that Yunis never stayed in a city long enough for the city to claim him, yet he always left behind something unseen, like a question that continues to echo after speech has ended. As midday approached and the light became more direct, less forgiving in its clarity, Yunis turned toward the road that leads away from the city. Though he did not hurry for departure, was never an act of escape but simply another form of arrival. Behind him, Mashhad continued its life uninterrupted, unaware that it had been briefly observed with such quiet attention. And it is said that long after he had left its streets, those who had crossed his path that morning sometimes remembered him without knowing why, not as a man of words or deeds, but as a passing stillness that briefly revealed how everything is always leaving even while it is present. Thus Dervish Yunis returned once more to the long road between cities, carrying nothing but the unseen weight of what he had listened to in the silent streets of dawn, where even ordinary moments spoke softly of eternity before fading into the day.